In the wake of the Civil War, after the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, you had a flowering of democracy in the South.
There were federal troops at the voting polls to protect the right of black men to vote. Women did not have the right to vote at that time.
You had 90% voter participation rates among African American men. Hundreds of them elected to state legislatures, to Congress, as governor, as senator. It was a really extraordinary experiment in democracy.
The registration process in a lot of the world is automatic. Once you turn of age, whatever that may be, you're registered. In the United States, you have to do this extra step and actually go out and register to vote.
Voter registration is really something designed to suppress voting and suppress participation. It's just a barrier.
I think if we had automatic voter registration, whereby when persons went to a government agency, they were registered to vote if they were eligible unless they declined, would streamline the process, provide better customer service to voters, and make it easier on election administrators, and it would be a whole lot cheaper for taxpayers.
Registration started as a tool of disenfranchisement. South Carolina in particular started requiring that voters register and re-register in the 1870s and 1880s. The reason it was a tool of disenfranchisement is because African American men in particular, they didn't know when they were born. A lot of streets didn't have names, so all of this information required in order to register to vote was just not available to them. But also, the requirement that people re-register, they often had to go to places where there were no registrars, right? So they would just close the office. There was nowhere to re-register. Within a few years, the African American voting population in South Carolina in particular dropped by more than 50%.
In the North, during the same period, at the late 19th century, there are a lot of different procedural laws passed to try to keep working people from voting, to try to make it more difficult for them to vote. A number of states, including New York, for example, had a requirement of personal annual registration only for people who lived in a larger city. It did not apply statewide. There were specific discriminatory measures passed. One of my favorite also happened to occur in New York State in the early 20th century. The target was the Jewish community, which seemed to have a serious proclivity for voting socialist. And so a registration law was passed that said that there were only 2 days on which you could register to vote in the upcoming elections, and they happened to be the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Other ways to winnow out new communities of voters, African Americans, Hispanics, and immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. You would require literacy tests in order to register, not to vote, but to register to vote. You had to prove you could read English. Or you had to prove what were called understanding tests. You had to prove your ability to understand the state constitution, a clause from the state constitution. This was especially used in the South.
The phrase poll tax does not refer, as we tend to think of, that it's a tax on voting. Poll comes from the Latin meaning head. It was a head tax on a head of household. And in many places, you still had to pay a poll tax in order to vote into the 20th century.
The poll tax was an instrument that was used to suppress both the black vote and to suppress poor whites participating in the political process. And it worked.
Earlier on, there were pauper laws. You couldn't vote if you were on the public dole.
Those laws remain on the books and remain constitutional until the mid-1960s, when a Supreme Court case finally determines that, in the words of the decision, wealth is not germane to the right to vote.
In the South, the effect was much more dramatic than in the North, because the South, it was accompanied by tremendous racial violence. This was the period of the Klan. This was the period of semi-institutionalized lynchings. Violence around the franchise was one of the defining features of Jim Crow.
You had in Alabama something called a Negro hunt, where voters were shot at en masse by terrorists. It wasn't just angry words. There was a great deal of really lethal violence directed at people trying to exercise their right to vote.
The Colfax Massacre is important because it is a symbol of the fact that it was the beginning of the end. We were still in a period of Reconstruction, but African Americans were still not safe, even with federal military presence in the South, because of the fact that white Democrats were committed to the ideal of white supremacy and taking back state governments to the point of murder.
The thing to understand is that in the 19th century, when you hear the word Republican, put in your head Democrat. And you hear the word Democrat, put in your head Republican. The parties literally exchanged who they were over the 100 years following the Civil War. Initially, the Republican Party was a somewhat radical party that emphasized inclusion. They wanted emancipation now, and by 1865, they began to call for full basic civil rights for African Americans, including, ultimately, the right to vote. Meanwhile, the Democrats, they were the ones who opposed all these changes. They also organized a campaign of terror, best known under the name Ku Klux Klan, though there were lots of groups that operated during this period, in efforts to exclude people from voting by basically scaring them away from the vote. And the idea was, if we could scare them away from the vote just once, so that we can win the state government, then we could write the laws and we could make it harder and harder for them to vote in the future.
During this period, the Supreme Court was actually pretty committed to reading federal power very narrowly. In a case called U.S. versus Reese, the Supreme Court struck down part of the Enforcement Act of 1871, which would have allowed the federal government to go after individuals who abridged the right to vote of African Americans. But they struck it down on the grounds that it didn't mention abridgment on the basis of race, to track the language of the 15th Amendment. In the presidential election of 1876, Governor Samuel Tilden won the popular vote by 250,000, and he needed one electoral vote in order to secure the presidency. The problem is that there were disputed counts in 3 southern states. In Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, the election boards were still run by Republicans, but that year they had just elected Democratic governors. So there was a change on the horizon in terms of states starting to trend back towards the Democratic Party. And so they cut a deal. A commission was formed, and they agreed that they would give Hayes the presidency if he pulled troops out of the southern states. So the presidential election of 1876 ultimately led to the end of Reconstruction.
What followed was the crackdown on black people, the crackdown on black voting rights, the rise of Jim Crow segregation all throughout the South.
Maybe 10% of black voters in 1880 could still vote in 1900.
The U.S. is one of the most restrictive democracies when it comes to felon rights because of our history with racism.
There are 6 million people in the country that cannot vote by virtue of having a felony conviction. So any reasonable position should be that once you have gotten out of prison, you're back in society, you're paying taxes, you're expected to be a productive citizen, you ought to get your rights to vote back.
It's not one of those things that deters crime. All it does, though, is for those who have done crime and for those who have paid for their crime, it takes away something that actually helps them to feel the dignity of being a citizen.
I think that we believe that people can be redeemed and that people should still have a voice whether or not they made a mistake in their lives. And they should still be able to make decisions that impact their world.
If we want people to engage in pro-social behavior, people who have made mistakes in their past, we need to give them the opportunities and the tools. And voting is about the most pro-social act we have. The great historian Taylor Branch always calls the right to vote a little piece of nonviolence because it's how we resolve our political differences.
The vast majority of states have some sort of system in place where generally you complete your jail time, probation, and parole, and you can vote again. There's 2 states where you can actually vote from prison by absentee ballot. That's Vermont and Maine. And then along with Florida, Iowa and Kentucky have sort of individual mandates where you have to go and plead your case to try to get your voting rights back.
What voting rights at its core is about who gets a seat at the table. And so when you think about felon disenfranchisement, which voice is missing from our conversations about criminal justice reform, about the inequities of what we're spending in terms of education versus prisons, than folks who have actually been through the process.
From the time I got out of prison to the time I got my voting rights was approximately 15 years. The first time I voted, I was so incredibly proud. It was just an amazing feeling to know that I was not the same person that I had been years before when I was convicted. So as I got older, I realized that I needed to be able to vote to make a difference in my community.
Voting is your tool of expression. As you pay your taxes, you live in society. Voting and who's in elected office literally determines the rules of the game. I'm a Broward County School Board member that represents District 5, and we have a very comprehensive program with the Supervisor of Elections where we start registering young people to vote in schools at 16 and 17. And once they become 18, then they are able to actually go out and cast their vote. And as we look at the history of this country, we know that significant change has happened over and over again when young people organized, raised their voices, and matured to voting age and voted and got the changes that we need.
As a convicted felon, I have lost my voting rights, among other rights, and I made a decision that I was not going to allow the time that I was given to break me, to crush me, to just make me another victim of the system. I was going to use that time to develop skills, to develop completely new character, integrity, and all the things that I would need to ultimately leave prison after that 10 years and be able to create the successes that I now have, being out about 9 years now. I think the ability to have my rights restored is like a stamp of approval, if you will. I'm like, hey, the past is the past, and now you've moved on, and I'm not still stuck in paying perpetually for choices I made 25 years ago.
They say you don't appreciate things until you've lost it, you know? And I tell you, when you talk about being able to walk into a voting booth, there's nothing that speaks more to American citizenship. That's that one time when you are on equal footing with everyone. So I have a personal stake in this because of the many stories that I've heard while traveling the state of Florida. Men and women from all political persuasions, all racial backgrounds, who have made mistakes and paid their debt, and years after they have served all their time, they still cannot vote. And just to hear the pain in their voices, you know, and stories of veterans who've put their lives on the line for this country and wrote a bad check and for 30 years not allowed to vote. That's what drives me, and that's what gives me the energy to wake up every day and champion this cause.
In the last decade, you've seen a wave of new laws all across the country designed to make it harder to vote for the first time since the Jim Crow era. And these laws hit harder minorities, young people, poorer people, older people.
Sloppy and ill-designed purge practices can have devastating impacts for eligible citizens. If someone is purged, shows up to vote, in most states, they're going to have a really hard time casting a ballot that will count.
So voter purges are actually not new. They get a lot of attention now because the Supreme Court recently heard a case out of Ohio that dealt with Ohio's attempt to purge its voter rolls and whether or not that attempt was consistent with the National Voter Registration Act. The Supreme Court upheld Ohio's system for purging their voters and cleaning their voter rolls. So it's likely that we'll hear more about voter purges going forward. But in the 2000 election, voter purges actually played a huge role in purging voters from the rolls who were otherwise qualified to turn out. And so it's long been sort of this technique used to disenfranchise individuals whose names are similar to someone who might be deceased, who might have a name that's similar to someone who has a felony conviction and therefore cannot vote. And so these people get caught up when states do these voter purges, and oftentimes they don't find out that they're disenfranchised until they actually go to the polls to try to vote.
This is a remediable problem in that we can demand high standards for what states do and localities do when they're trying to remove people from the rolls. We can give individuals notice before that they are removed. We can demand public notice before we have large-scale removals, and we can just make sure that the processes are happening under the timeframes and under the protections that Congress set out.
The people who we vote into office, we need to make sure that when we vote them in, we know who we're voting for, why we're voting for them, and what we expect out of them. so that if they don't fulfill their promises, we can kick them out next election cycle.
If voters aren't educated and don't prioritize the issues over the person, then we'll elect people who shouldn't be in office, and that'll further perpetuate the issues that we have and bring about more problems.
We do have a voice, and we do have power, and we do have ways to make people accountable.